Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone participating and watching today. Thank you for joining us to launch the ITF's flagship publication, the Transport Outlook 2021. During this session, we will hear about the key takeaways from the Outlook, and there will then be targeted sessions for each of urban and non-urban passenger transport and freight transport to follow this one over the course of the morning. Over the course of these sessions, we will hear from chapter authors, ITF modelers, and invited guest speakers. In this first session, the Outlook's project manager, Malithi Fernando, will present top findings of the report. And we will then be joined by ITF's lead modeler, Luis Martinez, for a Q&A session. Throughout this session, I invite those of you participating through the conference platform to please use the Q&A function that you can see on your screen to submit any questions that you would like our participants to discuss. There is also a discussion box for you to chat with others in the session. However, I would ask you to please note, excuse me, that this box will not be monitored by ITF staff. So I would encourage you again to please use that Q&A function for any question you want us to address. Finally, should you experience any technical difficulties, there is a live support button that you can see in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Please do use that to communicate with the technical staff behind the scenes. And with that, I will now hand over to Jari Kappala, the head of our quantitative policy analysis team, to get proceedings underway. Jari.
Thank you, Ola. And good morning, everyone from Paris. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to this full day dedicated to the ITF Transport Outlook 2021. We will have presentations and panel discussions around the key findings from this Outlook released just yesterday. ITF Transport Outlook presents long-term projections for transport demand and related CO2 emissions under alternative policy scenarios. These scenarios are based on our in-house models covering all modes of transport, freight and passenger, both globally, nationally, and even at the levels of every city in the world. For us at the ITF, the Outlook is a strategic tool. It helps us to analyze how the world could change if we choose different policies and different development paths. Now, today, more than ever, there really is a need for such analysis. The COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically affected our daily lives and challenged the way we work, travel, and live. At the same time, the pandemic has highlighted the critical role the transport sector plays to ensure functioning of our society. Now recovery has started, but how the pandemic will change the mobility of people and the transport of goods over the longer term is still very much uncertain. This edition of the Outlook has a specific focus on the impacts of COVID-19 on transport, providing answers exactly to that question. But we must not lose sight of our vision for transport's future, economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable transport. As our results show, current decarbonization policies are not ambitious enough to meet climate goals set in the Paris Agreement. However, more ambitious decarbonization policies together with well-targeted economic stimulus packages would bring the climate goals of the Paris Agreement within reach faster and with more certainty. So there is an opportunity to reshape the transport sector by aligning policies to revive the economy, combat climate change, and strengthen social cohesion of our societies, as shown by the new edition of Transport Outlook. The policy scenarios presented in this report are designed to explore possible futures based on a number of assumptions. And given the uncertainties and complexities of these assumptions, these scenarios should not be seen as forecasts for the next 30 years. For us, they are rather simulations to understand what role public policy can play in designing the future transport system. So we consider Outlook as a discussion starter. But at the same time, today, it is also a call for action. It is call for action to reshape mobility in the wake of COVID-19. It is now my great pleasure to give the floor to my colleague, Malithi Fernando, who has managed the preparations of this year's edition of the Outlook. She will be giving an overview of the key findings of the new Transport Outlook 2021, but I also hope you will enjoy the rest of the session and the whole Outlook Day with our Outlook authors and invited guests in panel debates. And also, I hope you will participate actively in the debate through the question and answer function. Thank you very much, and Malithi, over to you.
Apologies there. Thank you, Jari. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Malithi Fernando, and I had the pleasure of managing the 2021 edition of the Transport Outlook. My presentation today is a bird's eye view. It gives an overview of the entire transport sector and our main findings, and draws from the first and second chapters of the report. So you can take a look there if you'd like more details. We'll start off with a quick summary of the 3 policy scenarios that we model in this publication. They represent 3 different levels of ambition when it comes to decarbonizing transport. The first, Recover, looks at a return to our current policy trajectory. It tracks where we would be in a few decades if governments follow through on all implemented and announced policies from before the pandemic. Apart from that, we essentially return to pre-pandemic life. Reshape offers a completely different trajectory. The commitments coming out of the pandemic are transformational, and there's a focus on green recovery that goes far beyond original commitments. Reshape Plus, we identify where travel behavior and economic stimulus could be leveraged to boost policies in Reshape after the pandemic. It front loads the implementation of these policies during the recovery period. Now, what I mean by leveraging travel behavior is encouraging trends seen during the pandemic, such as increased walking and cycling or teleconferencing instead of business travel. First off, we'll take a look at where the transport sector is headed in terms of demand for travel and the resulting emissions. These are the results of our Recover scenario. And after that, we'll spend some time looking at policy recommendations. Starting off with demand, under our current level of policy ambition, we expect the demand for passenger travel and the movement of goods to more than double between 2015 and 2050. The dip in 2020 is temporary, and we're already seeing pre-pandemic levels of traffic in some areas. Much of this growth is due to growth in passenger travel and freight demand is driven by population growth and increasing prosperity around the world. This is compounded to a certain extent because the regions experiencing the highest levels of population growth are also the regions of rapid economic growth. What does this mean for greenhouse gas emissions? Well, measured as the equivalent CO2 emissions, we estimate that the transport sector will see a 16% growth in emissions by 2050. This would overshoot the level needed to have a chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by about 3 times. Of course, when looking at global warming, the total emissions are what matters. But when it comes to identifying where responsibility may lie in generating these emissions and now leading the charge to decarbonize the sector, we see a strong correlation between the world regions that generate the highest GDP per capita and where individuals emit the most transport emissions. The good news is that these are also the world regions with the capital and the technological means to take a leading role in reducing emissions. Now, how do we move from this fairly grim picture of where we are headed to what is possible with strong commitments and, more importantly, action? How do you create a transport system that's more sustainable and more equitable? Well, we have 6 insights for policymakers to reshape their transport systems in this very unique time in history. First off, we need to raise ambition to reverse CO2 emission growth. This graph shows clearly, with the dark blue line there, that if we stick to our current efforts, it is not enough to hit the CO2 reductions needed by 2030 and 2050, which would be compatible with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. As countries are revising their commitments this year to the Paris Agreement, there is a chance to do things differently. Under a reshape type policy scenario, we have a chance of just about meeting these carbon targets. But Reshape Plus, shown here in the green line, which seeks to front load and further leverage opportunities during recovery from the pandemic, it offers a chance to meet these objectives sooner and with more certainty. It achieves a 70% reduction in emissions by 2050. These environmental ambitions need to be aligned with COVID-19 recovery policies to ensure that the economy recovers and policies to create more equitable systems than before. Focusing on one at the expense of another will essentially mean 1 step forward and 2 steps back. Now, why do we need to do this? Well, let's take a look at the status quo. Within countries, inequality is growing. These are the kinds of inequalities people see day to day and experience. The causes and consequences of climate change are also unequally distributed. Wealthier countries and individuals have had a historically higher carbon footprint, while the people suffering the consequences of climate change are very low emitters. Inequalities extend to transport access as well. It has a huge impact on people's well-being. Those that are well off have higher transport access and therefore access to greater opportunities in life, while vulnerable groups in both developing and developed regions may be limited in the types of jobs that they can access. They may not be able to get to healthy food or healthcare. They may experience isolation, all because of these poor transport systems. COVID-19 has exacerbated many of the economic losses, especially for those in precarious jobs. And those that rely on public transport stand to lose one of the only forms of transport available to them if public transport is not prioritized as we emerge from this crisis. So what's the solution? We believe it is aligned action. Our results and recommendations from this outlook are a contribution to this. First off, the policy measures we look at, they tackle decarbonization, so from an environmental perspective. But beyond that, they also help job creation, they help improve the economic efficiency of cities, and connect people to these jobs. From a social perspective, many measures focus on improving access for groups like children, older people, women, people with mobility restrictions, whose travel needs have been poorly catered to in our existing systems. We also highlight where some decarbonization measures, especially those involving pricing, need to be considered with an understanding of the local context and exactly who will be affected, how and to what extent, to ensure that they are implemented fairly and effectively. One of the most important ways to align these goals is to move from mobility-focused policies to accessibility-focused policies. What do we mean by this? Accessibility-focused policies ensure that people have access to opportunities and goods without putting the focus on traveling more or traveling faster. It's good for people, it's good for the environment, and it makes good economic sense. These are the policies to encourage denser neighborhoods where you can work, send your kids to school, shop, meet friends. And when you do need to go elsewhere in your region or in the city, you can easily access a transport hub where you can use public transport or shared mobility if that's more appropriate, using a variety of other sustainable modes, ideally walking, cycling, scooters. Some of us got a glimpse of this during the pandemic as we walked and cycled more, and our trips stayed closer to home. Wouldn't it be convenient if all our errands were also easier to complete close by? This is very different to the mobility-focused, private car-centric model that has been traditionally used in transport planning. It leads to building more and wider roads, inducing more and more car traffic. These principles of accessibility apply also to freight, moving from longer supply chains and faster transport to consolidating loads and shorter, more resilient supply chains. Accessibility-focused policies help to reduce travel demand, but to a different extent based on sector. We see here the difference in demand in 2050 for each sector under the current policy trajectory and our most ambitious scenario. In cities, accessibility-focused policies have a significant impact lowering demand. People travel 22% less. Freight as well achieves an 18% reduction in activity through shortened supply chains, asset sharing, consolidation of loads, and so on. In regional and intercity travel, or non-urban passenger transport, demand reduction is very difficult. Lower volumes of people are traveling over longer distances. This is especially true for regional travel between rural areas and between rural areas and cities. Much of the demand reduction we see overall for this sector is actually due to a reduction in air travel between cities in our most ambitious scenario. So it is important to realize that the types of measures we apply to different sectors will depend on their unique characteristics. Regional differences will also come into play. My colleagues will be going into the sector-specific details in the following sessions. But for now, generally speaking, traveling outside of cities where possible should be shifted to cleaner modes, such as rail. But globally, the largest benefit we see in terms of just the CO2 reduction comes from cleaner technology. And this applies to trucks, buses, cars, all motorized transport. However, we don't yet have the ability to shift completely away from fossil fuel-based technologies. We do need more development to decarbonize the sector. We need to invest in developing new fuels and vehicles that are affordable and available quickly. We need to encourage their adoption by providing financial incentives and investing in public charging infrastructure. It is crucial that we target shared and high-use vehicle fleets, such as delivery vehicles, buses, shared mobility, so we can reap the most benefits compared to just private cars. Lastly, improvements don't need to be in vehicles and fuels alone. We can already optimize operations through data sharing and digitalization so that, for example, by having access to real-time information, you can use the most efficient route. This has immense benefits for both passenger travel and freight transport. Last of all, in order to achieve any of the policy strategies mentioned before, we need to seek out greater collaboration outside of the transport sector, and even within its more disparate parts. Moving to clean transport means relying on alternative energy sources. So if you have an electric bus fleet, you're not going to be truly zero emission unless your electricity grid is also based on renewable energy. Sectors such as trade and tourism are deeply connected to the transport industry. And during the pandemic, we saw very clearly what an important economic role tourism plays. To ensure the long-term sustainability of the industry, sustainable transport will be central. The private and public sector collaboration is becoming increasingly important as new mobility services are introduced from the private sector. We need to boost their social benefits, but keep the environmental and social costs in check, which requires closer relationships with public authorities. And bringing us back all the way to the point on accessibility, land use and transport planning must be integrated to achieve greater access to opportunities without forcing people to travel more. In closing, of the 6 policy takeaways that we have discussed, at the very least, the 4 to walk away with today are: number 1, we need to increase ambition. We are not headed in the right direction with our existing policies. 2, we need to align economic recovery with these decarbonization initiatives and those to create more equitable transport systems. We can achieve this by focusing on access to opportunities and not more travel. And beyond that, we will need to rely on further technological development to move away from fossil fuel dependency. The longer we wait to make these changes, the harder and more drastic they will need to be to limit global warming. And we are at a very unique time in history. As we recover from this global crisis, and as countries are revising their commitments to the Paris Agreement targets, the transport outlook shows that we have a chance, if we act now, to reshape transport for a cleaner environment and fairer societies. Thank you very much for your attention during this presentation. I look forward to hearing from you during our Q&A session, and I'll hand the floor back to Orla.
Thank you, Malithi, for that great overview of the findings from the Outlook. I would now like to invite you to stay and to ask Luis Martinez, our lead modeler, to join us so we can discuss some of the points that we know to be of interest. I would invite participants to please use the Q&A function, and we would be very interested to know what your questions are. But Malithi and Luis, if you will indulge me. So we know from our work that public transport is the big question. You know, we are asked about, after COVID, what is public transport going to do? So Malithi, perhaps I can come to you first and ask, what, based on the outlook, can we do to boost public transport going forwards?
Thanks, Orla. It's very true. Public transport is one of the biggest questions right now, and it will remain one of our key parts of a sustainable transport network. We identify it in all our scenarios that it needs to be the backbone. And so what the pandemic has perhaps revealed to us is some shortcomings in how public transport is funded or financed in some cities. It doesn't necessarily reflect the very unique role that public transport plays, both from an environmental perspective and a social perspective. Many people rely on public transport as one of their only forms of transport. And environmentally speaking, there's really no alternative to how efficient it is in moving large numbers of people. So coming out of the pandemic, we need to maintain and increase our support for public transport. If there's drops in services, less coverage of routes, less reliability, it stands to lose ridership, which could really threaten the ability to achieve some of our sustainable transport goals. There will need to be creativity in how we finance. This could look like transit-oriented development and leveraging land value. It could look like employer contributions, et cetera. There are numbers of ways to move beyond a fare-based financing for public transport. And we also identify in the outlook the need to shift our priority from spending on private car-related infrastructure to a more diverse set: public transport, active travel. We do need people to get to public transport safely and effectively. So I would say that it's a combination of those things, but very important to keep supporting public transport after the crisis.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And we do have some questions coming in now. So Luis, I will turn to you first, if that's okay. We have a question here from Nicolas. What are the main inflections compared to the last transport outlook, please?
Okay, thank you, Orla. Good morning, all. The main inflections from the previous report, I would interpret this in the changes on the forecast that we have from one report to the other. I think they are dual. I think we revise the transport demand growth to reduce compared to our 2019 publication. And the main two reasons for this are reliant on the expected economic growth that was already forecasted for the previous outlook on the next decades, but also the role of some measures that were already implemented in the this years or are forecasted to be implemented in the next years that will already reduce significantly some of this induced demand that we were saying if we are focused more in mobility than in accessibility. And this was mainly due to the initiatives that were taken on the urban sector.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Luis, and thank you, Nicola, for that great question. And Luis, you mentioned about the change from mobility to accessibility, and that is indeed another question we have here from Mathilde. Malithi, I think probably we start with you on this one. So many countries are developing mobility-based policies, but now obviously we're recommending the move to adopting an accessibility approach. So how can we convert the existing trend that was at the time considered to be a great innovation? What are we actually saying to policymakers in terms of how they take this forwards?
That is a great question. And one of the reasons perhaps that we're still focused on these mobility-based policies is that we're still thinking of the private car as our main mode of transport. And so of course, if you want to travel smoothly with a private car, you want wide lanes, you want faster travel and less congestion. However, this doesn't take into account some of the externalities of such development. There are safety costs, there are environmental costs, there are health costs to neighborhoods where you can't really walk and go about your day doing your errands in an active manner. There are mental health costs associated with the air pollution, noise pollution. So there are a number of these disbenefits that we don't necessarily account for. And what we do disproportionately account for is travel time savings. And these are often going to point you in the direction of mobility-focused policies that benefit a smaller portion of the population than if you looked at a more holistic accessibility focused view. So I would say that perhaps one of the answers to this question is that we need to be careful about what value we put on certain benefits and what we actually include in our analysis when deciding on these projects.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mathilde, for that question. So we have a question now, which I think links to a number of key topics for the ITF and our wider work. And Brendan is asking about, following up on that public transport question. So focusing on public transport is all well and good, but what do we do about lower density regions? So the suburbs and rural areas, and going further than that, I would say, how does the decentralization of cities potentially impact what we can hope to achieve?
Yes.
Luis, go ahead.
Thank you. If what we need when we say that and what we mean when we say that the public transport should be the central or the backbone of all the system, we are mainly saying that for the main corridors, for the high load demands, we want to keep public transport as the backbone and be the structure of it. But we have to also upgrade public transport formulation and use the technologies that we have currently to go into more real-time planning on, especially in low demand areas where we go on demand systems and rely also on shared mobility services to feed into the backbone that will be the main infrastructure base of public transport. Then I think this information, data availability and the digitalization will also be the key element that will put all this together. Also, we should not forget the increase on mobility as a service, as a trend that is just under discussion, but we see that a lot of developments recently and going forward in several countries. And what we are changing the mentality also of people of being a vehicle-based mobility, where we get a vehicle and then we want to use it for all purposes, to have a service-based mobility where we use the transport that is more suited for the purpose and for the situation. And I think this could be really also a game change in urban mobility, but also in less peri-urban or rural areas.
Great, thank you very much, Luis. And if, Malithi, perhaps I could pivot slightly on this topic to you from a policymaker's perspective. Luis has mentioned digitization and innovation, and we have another question come in here from Eric on mobility poverty. So how do we ensure that vulnerable citizen groups, such as elderly people, people with disabilities, or potentially those who may not have the wherewithal to engage with a digitized mobility system, what policies are there to account for them?
For sure. So the importance of digitalization, I would say, is partially to, as Luis mentioned, for people to access these new services, but even more so to optimize the running of these services that Luis has mentioned. From a user perspective, it is going to be extremely important, as long as we have a digital divide, that that alternatives are available for groups that may not have access or don't use such technologies like a smartphone. And beyond that, the services, there will always be a need for specific dedicated services, of course. But for kind of groups who could use public transport, or could, use some sort of active mode, or use a sidewalk to get where they need to go, if we do improve the walking and cycling and micromobility infrastructure, anyone on wheels would benefit from an environment that does not have as many obstacles. We have access to public transport at grade. Those types of examples do expand the existing public transport and active networks to a greater portion of the population. But I would say that it's true, there will, I believe, need to be dedicated services as well, and we're not advocating against that, for sure.
Excellent. Thank you both. And thank you to Brendan and Eric. And Brendan, I would just mention that one of my colleagues is currently doing work on innovative mobility for peripheral communities. You'll find that information on our website. So if it is an area that you're interested in, I would encourage you to go and look it up. We've touched on, sort of fairness there and equity, which is obviously a key theme of the outlook as a whole. Luis, perhaps I could come to you. What are the incentives for developing countries, not looking to simply follow up, but to in fact potentially leapfrog other countries and achieve a decarbonization where other countries may be a little bit slower behind? Could you comment a little bit more on that in terms of fairness and opportunity costs, perhaps, please?
Yes, thank you, Orla, for that question. I would say that the challenges and the opportunities are there. The challenges is also to change a little bit the mindset, especially in developing countries, that you see still a car or the ability of private mobility as a target in your life, your life targets. And this is something that we need to change, but also it's an opportunity, if we are not still there, to change mentalities, but also for the authorities to provide the services and the infrastructure that allows also the inhabitants with less resources to access not to just to move, but just further and further. Then there is a need for a better connection between land use and transport to when we're creating when we have in a very fast areas where there is a very fast growth, it's very difficult to plan. And normally it comes with sprawl, it comes with creating of urban connect areas of the city that are not connected to public transport. And this has to be one thing that authorities have to plan ahead. To try to increase the planning, we have to be aware that there is the role of course, there is very fast growth in urban areas because there is this need, but then maybe we have to rely initially in alternatives of public transport that allow this penetration in these areas with that are growing faster, but already plan and use digitalization for this, and then plan public transport as a backbone for all mobility within this. This is also an opportunity of reducing the investment in other types of resources that we have in infrastructure, because as Maliti mentioned, what we are currently doing in most of the cities, or we do it in the last 30 years, is creating more highways, more motorways, or increasing the space consumed. Then there is also an opportunity to migrate part of this infrastructure investment to other type of investment that would be more on digitalization, on services, and also on the provision of the backbone infrastructure of public transport in this area, these cities that are growing very fast. It's complicated, but it's a challenge, but I think it's also an opportunity for us to do a leapfrogging, as you mentioned.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Now, we only have a minute left on the questions. So, Maliti, perhaps I could just come back to you very quickly in terms of looking forwards from where we are now. And obviously, we've observed very rapid changes, as our virtual summit attests, to how people work and commute. Do we have any thoughts on how changes in these patterns might affect sustainable transport in cities in the future?
Thanks, Orla. Yes, this is a big question, and I'm not going to pretend that we have a concrete answer for this. When people stop commuting, well, of course, it also depends on how much teleworking takes off in the future. This has been a grand experiment, but in terms of longevity of these trends, we don't know. We do also know that it's not the majority of jobs that can switch to telework. So assuming that a large portion of the people who do continue to telework, the changes to transport will depend. If we're moving away from traveling via metro into the city center, and instead you're going to complete some local trips close to home by walking to the grocery store, maybe biking somewhere, that will look very different to if a trip is replaced by longer trips for errands, if this isn't happening in a more car-centric suburb. So really the trade-off is that once people stop commuting, they do replace those trips with other trips. The nature of the trips that are being replaced will determine what the net effect will be. So right now, I would say it remains to be seen. We do think that it probably will have a net positive impact, especially from a teleconferencing and business travel point of view, as well as urban trends. But we'll have to wait and see.
CBC. Okay, thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, that is all we have time for this session. I'd like to thank Maliti and Luis for answering questions. I hope those of you watching will join us for our next session, which will focus on urban passenger transport. And we will be joined by our distinguished guest speaker, Marusha Kardama, the Secretary General of the SLOCAT Partnership. To navigate to that session, just use the back to timeline option in the top right-hand corner or left-hand corner possibly of your screen, and choose the morning session for urban passenger transport. For those of you leaving us, the Outlook is available on the ITF webpage, and from that you will be able to get links to summaries, results, and it will also be available, the results will be available to download from the OECD statistics webpage. That is all I have time for now, but I hope to see you again shortly in that next session, and have a lovely day.